And I'm truly delighted to introduce Mark H. today. Mark is an assistant professor of directing and acting in the Department of Theater and Drama here at UW-Madison. He joined the faculty here in fall 2019, and we're absolutely thrilled that he accepted the African Study Program's invitation to affiliate with the program. Mark is a director, a performer, an educator. His primary focus is on American theater and the theater of the African diaspora, African American theater, and the theater of the African diaspora. His directing highlights include Julius Caesar, King Lear, The Cherry Orchard, and Dontrell Who Kissed the Sea. Along with directing, Mark has also worked extensively as a professional actor with some of the nation's leading theater companies, including the Steppenwolf Theater Company. Mark H. received his BFA in acting from Rutgers University. He's also a graduate of the MFA directing program at Columbia University School of Arts, and he was also trained classically at Shakespeare's Global Theatre in London. I could be mistaken, but I can't think of another time when a theater director and a performer presented at Africa at Noon, and so I'm incredibly excited to hear Mark present today on The Way of the NeoGriot, a journey towards a true African American theater. And so I will now turn it over to Mark. Welcome.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Neil. I appreciate it. This place is popping. That was some amazing announcements. There's so much going on here. That's so many exciting things going on that I'm super feel super blessed to be here and to be a part of this community. So hello everyone. Hamjambo to my Kiswahili speakers. So you got my introduction. My full name is Mark Hairston, but I do go by Mark H professionally. And I'm coming here to you today from this Mahali pa Kuburudisha, this entertainment space from Tanzania. I took this a couple years ago when I was there studying Kiswahili and East African performance cultures and Swahili theater. And yeah, I've been dreaming about getting back there, and especially on a really dreary rainy day like today. So I figured anyway it would be a good place to welcome all of you, my guests today. So karibuni, and welcome everyone for being here with me and listening to this talk. As this is my first time getting to speak at UW and to the greater African studies communities out there, I figured I would really take the time today to introduce myself and my work. So today's talk may feel a bit more informal, maybe a bit less academic than some of the previous talks. But I would like all of you to get to know me and my work a bit. And hopefully if I don't fail miserably, then I'll be invited back to talk more in depth about some more specific aspects of my research and my work. So with great excitement and with great nervousness and with your permission, I think we should go ahead and get started, all right? So as I was preparing this talk, I kept coming back to the title. I kept looking at that title and I kept thinking, it sounds nice, right? It sounds provocative. The way of the NeoGriot towards a true African-American theater. And I might have thought it sounded cool at the time, but as I sat down to prepare for this talk, I kept asking myself, like, what does this even mean? What does it even mean? So what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen for you. So you can actually see things. There we go. The way of the NeoGriot towards a true African-American theater. So I kept asking, what does this title even mean? So basically what I think, I'd like to start off today just talking about the title and kind of breaking it down and going through my process of interrogating it and dissecting it and figuring out, beyond like the sound of it, kind of what information it holds about me and my work. So in general, some of the general influences of this title are the way of the NeoGriot. The way comes from like Taoism, Tao, the way. I grew up. I've been a martial artist all my life and grew up really immersed not only in the practice of martial arts but also the philosophies, East Asian philosophies, and Taoism has been and Taoist ideas have been an important part of my life. So the way, this idea of the way found its way into this title. Also, Bruce Lee, one of his famous books is the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, the way of Jeet Kune Do. So that's kind of like a general, explanation for the way of the NeoGriot. And then the second part, towards a true African American theater. This idea of someone writing something, titled towards, there's lots of things out there, but two of the influences things that influenced, for me, influenced me and this title were, one is Alan Locke, who was, one of the key masterminds of the Harlem Renaissance, and also one of the founders of the African American, sorry, not the African American, the theater department at Howard University in DC, which is where I was born and raised. And he wrote a fascinating treatise on theater and the importance of a theater training institution for Black artists, titled Steps Towards a Negro Theater. And he wrote that in the 1922 edition of The Crisis magazine. And in it, he talks about, he lays out steps for creating, he said it was important to have a writing department, where people are producing new works, and just a general place where Black artists could go and really create themselves through theater and assert themselves, affirm themselves, all of those things. Another source that was influential in this title that I kind of pulled from, and maybe in the back of my mind, was a book called Towards a Poor Theater by a theater artist, director, and theoretician named Jerzy Grotowski, who was Polish, who was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. I won't go into a lot of this stuff, but this idea of poor theater, theater that is minimal, that uses few resources. That's kind of one of the things, one of the many things he talks about in that book, which he later in his life totally disavowed all of that work. But anyway, those are kind of the larger influences of this actual title. So breaking it down even further, this title holds, in it holds several meanings. So, in it we have the what, right? We have the subject, the object of the thing that we're trying to go towards, which is a true African American theater, right? We have the why, which is this idea of towards, for me, kind of symbolizes the why. It symbolizes a direction, a mission, purpose, and everything like that. And then we have a how, which is the way of the NeoGriot, which talks about, which for me implies steps, steps or practice, discipline, things like that. So in this title, we have the what, we have the why, and we have the how. So in my talk today, I'm going to try to break those things down first, just meaning wise, and then I'm going to, hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll understand what a true African American theater is, why I think it's important, and then and why I want to do this work, and then how I go about, or how I'm in a continual process of creating an African American theater, a true African American theater. All right. So let's start with the what, the goal, the object. The goal is a true African American theater. All right. So breaking this down, say what? Some definitions. So what is theater? Theater, in the way that I approach theater, a couple of things that theater are. It's a form of art, right? And it's an ancient technology for sight, communication, and healing. I'll also put development in there. An ancient technology for sight, communication, development, and healing. All right, so the word theater itself, we'll start with the word theater. Theater actually comes from the ancient Greek word theatron, which means the place for seeing. And this meant, the actual, you see a picture there of a typical outdoor Greek amphitheater, ancient Greek amphitheater. And this place for seeing, it meant the place itself, the actual location, this place where you would come to see a ritual or a spectacle. It meant a place also where members of the community could gather to see themselves, to commune with each other. And it was a place for receiving sight through the ritual, through the spectacle, whatever was being presented. It was a place where you would receive sight. And by sight, I mean a few things. I mean insight, hindsight, foresight, and divine sight, all right? So in watching theater, in coming to witness theater, people could see themselves up there, could see into themselves. They could see their condition and get some insight into their own condition, and maybe see themselves represented up there and learn more about themselves. Hindsight, you know, in seeing, you know, dramatizations of the past or etc. Members of the community could look back on those things, look back on their history and receive hindsight, you know, get some hindsight in that way, learn from those things. Foresight, you know, theater is a place that is not only, it's not only about the now, it's not only about what's happening in the space now and maybe what happened in the past and recreating that, but it's a place to imagine possible futures. It's a place to experiment and try out new models of being. So in that way, you know, it's a place for also receiving foresight. Also warnings, you know, to warn what may come, what may happen if we continue on these particular trajectories that we're going on. And then divine sight is the kind of most, I don't know, nebulous meaning, but like divine sight in the way I'm using it, really means it means a receiving of purpose, which in my understanding comes from the divine, inspiration, motivation. So that's what I mean by divine sight, a real a perception that's beyond, that's deeper than just the everyday, the physical realm that we in the realm of the senses that we live in. All right. So let's talk about theater as an art. Theater as an art form is very broad in the way I use it, in the way a lot of theater artists think about theater nowadays. So I think in general, the broad public associates theater with drama, with plays, with text. And you know, theater is much more than drama. I consider drama a subset of theater, a type of theater. But theater really encompasses a large range of expressions, which includes for me things like dance, things like certain you know, rituals, masquerades, things that don't necessarily have text in them, or things that aren't necessarily narrative, but which are theatrical in certain ways. So so that's theater as art. Now theater is technology. All right, so theater is technology. Let's break this down. So technology, you know, going back to the Greek again, we got technique, art, and craft. So that's embedded in technology, which I find very, very interesting. And then logia, of course, the study of or branch of knowledge. And currently, you know, nowadays we talk about technology and the meaning of technology, and as Oxford, the Oxford English Dictionary, you know, one of my best friends, describes that technology is the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes. All right, and if you break down science, science is the study of the physical and natural world based on observation and experiment. Also a body of knowledge on the subject. So putting that all together, technology is the application of knowledge of the physical and natural world based on observation and experiment for practical purposes. And those practical purposes, as I've said before, at least as it relates to theater, are sight, communication, development, and healing. And it's important for me to recognize that, like, you know, the knowledge that's gained from study of the physical and natural world, from what we observe and experiment with. Because in theater, we do this all the time. You know, people may not consider it science, but you know, we study the body, we study the human body, we study the human body in space, we study all sorts of things. We study the voice, we study the human psyche and all sorts of things like that. So there's an element of observation and practical knowledge from experiment that we do have in the theater as well. So I just want to point that out. So theater in my understanding, one of the things is a technology for site communication development and healing. All right, so what is African American? This is a very fraught question. Identity is always it's tough, right? But when we talk about African American, we're speaking of identity, questions of identity. We're speaking of origin, lineage from that origin, heritage received, passed down from that lineage, and then the culture being something that is part of that heritage, and also something that's continuously that's living and continuously developing. All right. So I consider African American, what I call African American is, as at least in my work, is a mix of African and American elements or influences, and also work that is by, for, and or about African Americans. All right, so that's going to lead me to my story, my African American story, my general and specific African American story. So, you know, I've been over the past several years really digging into my ancestry, and you'll see this map from ancestry.com, and you know you can take these DNA things for what it's worth, whatever you will. We know they're not totally accurate or anything like that, and you know there's lots of there's problems with them in general. But you get a general sense of my genetic ancestry, and having done lots of extensive research into my genealogy and everything else, this is actually pretty accurate, except for up here in the Scandinavias. I don't know what's going on with that, but there is the UK, and there was influence in the UK from that. I don't know. That could just be an anomaly up here, but basically this is what you have as far as my African American ancestry. Okay, so you got the American right here, you got West African, and you have European, predominantly Scottish, English, and there's also some Swiss in there. Okay, so looking at the American, we have, my family, I was born and raised in DC, but all of my family is from Southern Virginia, Southwest Virginia, specifically Roanoke, which is where my most immediate family is, back a few generations. But really like kind of all over this general area of Virginia. And then I also have relatives in North Carolina. So this general area is kind of where I'm from. And we know, that this is, I'm kind of blessed that my family hasn't migrated much and moved around a lot. They've kind of all been here for many, many generations in general. So it's a lot easier. It's been a lot easier for me to trace things back. I know a lot of African Americans aren't, have issues with that because records aren't kept. But we know that Virginia is where the earliest Africans were brought, and some of the oldest African communities exist there. So my family goes way back, and I'm able to trace back to at least the early 1700s, and still trying to get back farther, but there's a good chance farther back as well. All right. More general, you'll see Roanoke here, DC up here, my hometown, and all that. I'm just gonna skip through this a little bit. So some of the features, some of the places in Virginia where my family is from are Roanoke County, which is where Roanoke City is, and all that. Botetourt County, Henry County, Allegheny County, and that's basically all here. This is Roanoke right here, Botetourt, Allegheny. So they're all kind of in this area. Henry County's down here. So kind of right in here. And I say this, I only bring this up because I'm gonna go back. It's in the Appalachian region, or it's in the Blue Ridge Mountain range. Sits in a valley, Roanoke does, in between the mountains. And that's just one of the major features of that area. But it's in the Appalachian region, and that's important just because as I do my research and as I apply my research to my work, practices, culture of the Appalachian region, and all of that comes into play. All right, so that's Virginia. This is going way back. I won't get into all this, all this history, but my family, they were enslaved, as a lot of African American families were generations ago. And in Virginia, these are two of the places that they were. So my name Hairston is actually a Scottish name. that came here by Peter the Immigrant, who was the original Hairston, pronounced Harston by the Scottish, and immigrated over from England through Ireland and settled in Pennsylvania, and then they came down to the Virginia area. And basically the Hairstons ended up basically the wealthiest family at one point in the country, having a huge empire of plantations in that same area that my family is, Southern Virginia, North Carolina area. These are two that I trace my actual lineage back to, two places, Berry Hill and Beaver Creek. And then there's also Oak Hill Plantation and Coolimi, which is in a huge one, kind of the center one in North Carolina. My lineage most recently goes back to the Coolimi Plantation, which was owned by Peter Wilson Harston. All right, and I have a mingling of roots here because I've actually been able to trace on one side, on my dad's side, back to where an actual mingling of roots happened, where the African and the European collided, and it collided and created my great-great-grandfather, John Winston Hairston. Going back, he was married. So Peter Wilson Harston was married, and he clearly he had a child with one of his servants. Don't know the circumstances of that, but we can use our imagination. We know all kinds of stories, but my great-great-grandfather was born. Letitia Goolsby was his mother. And and so anyway, you can kind of see similarities, see the eyes, see these ears that are very distinct, jowls. It's just very fascinating. I was amazed to get these pictures. As an African American, again, a lot of us don't have access to these things. So to actually get these things felt really empowering and strangely and amazing. And I felt more deeply connected to this country than I had ever before, Anyway, a lot of information I've used in my research comes from, or a good starting point comes from this book, The Hairstons, which was written in 1999 by Henry Weincheck. Time magazine called it Not Since Mary Chestnut's Civil War has nonfiction about the South. And so I can't read that, so compelling. But it's a really great book. And a lot of amazing information comes from that. And I use that in my research. So my ancestry in general is West African, a mix of West African, European, and Native American. And when I talk about my ancestry, my story being both a general and a specific African American story, this is what I mean. A lot of African Americans in general have a mix of West African, European, and Native American in them. So in generally, that's the general thing. And then specifically, these are the areas that I have. My Cherokee heritage goes back to Joseph Sparrowhawk, who was relocated from Cherokee, North Carolina, or actually from the Virginia area, and ended up in Oklahoma, like a lot of Native Americans. And I also have Shawnee heritage going back to Chief Cornstalk. All right. So my story, both general and specifically African American. Now that brings us to the final part of this true African American theater definition, this breakdown. So what is it? What is true? What does it mean to be true? Well, going back to my friend Oxford English Dictionary, true means in accordance with fact or reality, rightly so called, real or actual, accurate and exact, upright or level, loyal or faithful. And this idea of realness, this idea of real authenticity, loyalty and faithfulness, that is the aspect of true that I think most closely fits with what I imagined when I put true in the title. It is an African-American theater that is real, authentic, loyal, and faithful, a faithful mix of African and American influences by, for, and or about African Americans. Which brings us to now the why, this word towards, journey, intention, direction, focus, mission, purpose. All right, the why. So why a true African American theater? And for that, I'm going to take a little detour and I'm going to read you a little story. And this is the origin story of the birth of the NeoGriot. All right. So as I was digging through some documents, I came across this story. And the story starts with a quote at the very top. And the quote reads, quote, "If some people forget their past as a way to survive, other people remember it for the same reason," unquote. And that was spoken or written by Maladona Patrice Somé, who is a West African man from Burkina Faso, from the Dagar tribe of Burkina Faso, who wrote the book of Water and the Spirit, as well as The Healing Wisdom of Africa, two books that I absolutely adore and find fascinating. But then the document goes on to actually tell the story from there. So the story reads, "Lightning struck me in the midst of a perfect storm of newfound social consciousness, creative power, and discontent. I emerged from the calm as the NeoGriot, African man of the Americas, a gatekeeper to other realms, blessed with vision and the power to alter reality. Many traditional African philosophies hold that all people are born with a unique purpose preordained in the spirit world, and that the human process of learning is really just the process of remembering what we already know. This remembering of self, of piecing the self back together, marks initiation into adulthood and comes with an understanding of one's purpose and an understanding of how one's unique gifts can contribute to society. I had been refining my particular gifts for 3 decades before theater helped me realize how I was meant to use them. As a young boy, I satisfied my scientific curiosity by mixing powerful potions from the elements I found around me, namely spices, condiments, and household cleaners. An early encounter with linguist Charles Berlitz's book, Passport to the World, sparked a lifelong fascination with language, verbal and physical. Mr. Berlitz taught me that ways of seeing and organizing the world are embedded even in the structures and sounds of the very words we speak. My world was changed. I could sometimes be found outside with my arms stretched to the sky, believing myself capable of controlling the wind. This power was especially appreciated during the suffocating summer days in Washington, D.C., when my ability to summon a breeze would bring sweet relief to the brown faces inhabiting my world. Starting at the age of 5, I began exploring the possibilities of the human body through the practice of martial arts, while being immersed in East Asian philosophies. In adolescence, I occupied much of my time mastering the manipulation of inanimate objects such as the basketball, the Chinese broadsword, and the clarinet. In high school came my introduction to theater, and the course was set. I ended 3 wonderful years of studying language and culture at Boston University, having experienced the freedom of independence, the pain of racism and homophobia, and the profundity of first love. I traded the city of Boston for the town of New Brunswick when the theater and Rutgers University called. Year 1 was Meisner, Chekhov, Viewpoints, Linklater, Williamson. Year 2 was London, The Globe, Laban, Alexander, The Alchemy of Voice, and Mike Alfreds. I swore every day that renowned English director Mike Alfreds hated me, but he pushed me, broke and rebuilt me, made me a firm believer in the primacy of the actor, and helped to liberate me from the specter of failure that threatened to keep my creative work on the level of good, but safe. After graduating with honors, I experienced a lot of life and worked hard to build a successful career as an actor with a body of work and a reputation that I was proud of. But then the lightning struck. Then the storm came, and I began to see the bodies in the streets. Trayvon, Oscar, Mike, Eric, and on and on and on and on. And I became haunted by the echoing cries of despair, and my individual successes quickly became less meaningful. I wondered how we would survive. And each time I did, I remembered that young boy who controlled the winds and cooled the cheeks of his people. Looking back, it is clear that I had always possessed the ability, the potential to be the man I was meant to be. I just needed to remember who he was, to remember my purpose. This work I do it to remind people who they are, to give them sight, to use the art of theater to guide, inspire, and heal by helping others locate themselves in society and the world in much the same way theater did for me. I do this work because I've never felt so challenged, so intrigued, so confident, so creative, so able, and so comfortable doing anything else. Theater has given me a lineage, an historical identity. It has challenged me to use my body to its fullest capabilities, its fullest powers. It has forced me to see society's ills and has given me the voice to confront them. It has taken a lifetime to become the NeoGriot. Now that I am, now that I am reborn, it is time to do the great work I was meant to do. So, the story of the NeoGriot, that's how the NeoGriot was born. That is how I became Mark H, the NeoGriot. All right, so what is a griot? What is the NeoGriot? All right, so neo, new, young, fresh, recent, something that exists in the present in a slightly different form from what it did in the past, a new version of, and then griot. A lot of us have heard of this word, the griot. It's possibly a French word. It's debated. There's other African languages that have words that it could have come from. But it's a word that usually describes a traditional West African figure, known in some other, commonly in other African languages as a jali or jelly. And there's also many other variant words in other languages. But this figure is typically understood to be a storyteller, a poet, and a musician. All right. But the word griot is a very controversial term, especially among griots themselves. A lot of them don't want to use the French term, and there's a kind of like, national wanting to distance themselves from that, and use an African term for it, a more traditional term. And there's other controversies around that. But as it relates to America and relates to African Americans, especially, the figure of the griot is something that we as African Americans have really have used often and have looked to often for inspiration, for guidance, and for a sense of self-identifying. All right, so the griot typically it comes from the griot was a very important figure in West Africa, specifically especially in like the Mali Empire. This is again from Ancestry, my DNA thing. I don't know why Chad is over here highlighted. Maybe there's some ancestral connection, genetic connection. I don't know, but either way, it was the empire didn't go up this far. It's kind of more around this area, but it was kind of more in this area that the griot was birthed. The role of the griot was a kind of major figure in many societies in that part of West Africa and Senegambia and all around here. All right. So the jobs of the griot. The griot was known as a storyteller, musician, and all that, but actually the griot was way more than that. The griot had so many different roles to play in their communities. They were artists, of course. They were historians, really repositories for the communal history, genealogies, and all of that. They were advisors. They are often advisors to royalty. If you look at in the Mali Empire, looking at a figure like Sanjata, who's in a lot of who has an epic that a lot of griots tell. He has a famous. He has a griot by his side as he goes on his journey. They were interpreters, they were teachers, exhorters, urging the community to action. They were praise singers, honoring the ancestors and current important figures, leaders, everything like that. They were warriors. Sometimes they were out on the field, on the battlefield, at war with the other warriors, and they were witnesses. They were figures in the society that were there looking at what's going on, keeping track of what's going on, taking it all in. And of course, that's important in their, as being repositories of history, to be able to be there, to be present, to take in the world and the community, the happenings of the community. So the jobs of the griot, so the NeoGriot basically is a new version, a griot for a new age, a griot for a new context, which is this American context, which is this particular new time that we are in. So that's part of why, that speaks to the jobs of the NeoGriot as part of the why, right? It's those responsibilities, those duties that I have taken on for myself as an artist and as a citizen. So that's part of the why. It lies in those fulfilling those responsibilities. But it's also, to create an African-American theater that is my own. It's an act of self-naming, just like I, chose to go by Mark H, the NeoGriot. That was an act of self-naming that came about as a result of a change, an important change that happened in my life, a new consciousness. And it was an act of freedom and an act of, me deciding to give myself a name. We've seen that with a lot of African Americans throughout history. Famous Malcolm X, the X's, Marvin X, theater practitioner, playwright, people like that. So it's an act of freedom, self-identifying, identity building, carving out a unique personal space. It's affirmations, to affirm, to remember, piecing together history, to empower, to honor. And it's really, honestly, it's a marrying of my personal and professional worlds. Like, it's just for me to be able to dig into my own history and to dig into those interests that I currently have, and to be able to marry those with my profession and my research and all that is like, it's amazing. It's actually, and they each nurture and are nurtured by each other. So yeah, now, as I wrap up, that leads us to the way, right? The way, which is the principles and practices of my work, the way that I go about being the NeoGriot, and the way I go about building my own unique African-American theater, all right? So we're gonna start with my principles, okay? These come from everywhere. So religion and spirituality. I grew up Christian. I never believed, and I was never into it. I just had to go to church with my mom. And it wasn't until, again, after I started really learning my own history and digging into my history, that I got more fascinated with the beliefs of my forebears, and started really looking into those things, especially traditional African religions. And they changed my world. Those ways of seeing the world were so new to me, and so helpful in so many ways to my life, to how I move, through space in the world, and also just how I, being able to use those principles in my work as well. So some of these religious principles that I find useful to me are, going back to ancient Egypt, we have Ma'at. Typically it means, basically harmony, righteousness, rightness, things to that effect. And it was a way of ordering ancient Egyptian society. That was like one of the main principles that definitely the pharaohs had to live by, and kind of what society was organized around. And its complement was Isfet, which is the opposite of that, which is kind of if one is good, then the other is more in evil energy, although those aren't proper terms for those things. But there's a duality. It speaks to a duality, seeing the world in a duality, and understanding the tension between those dualities and the world as we're pulled between forces. God, all right, the idea of a god or gods, the idea of there being a spiritual world, a world of spiritual forces, existing in this current world that can be manipulated for our use or against people, like they can be used in good ways and negative ways. But the belief in a kind of energy that you can use, that exists around us, that is connected to the spirit world. The idea of gateways, which are basically places in the physical realm that directly connect to the spiritual realm. Maladona Patricio May talks about these things in his book, the Healing Wisdom of Africa, and as he talks about rituals and things. And sometimes I like to think of the spaces I'm creating in theater, actual theater spaces that I create in those ways. And so as I'm creating my work, how am I endowing that space in such a way that I'm able to establish a connection to spirit, so that people can see when they come. 7 directions, I'm gonna go through these quickly. The 7 directions in the Bantu Congo philosophy, the belief that the 7th direction is the inner direction, and that, that's the one that a lot of us lose connection with. And so to be able to use ritual to be able to manipulate forces to help people get more in contact with the 7th direction, that internal core of self. The 4 directions in Cherokee Native American beliefs, as well as the sacred circle, Taoism, the 4 noble truths, and the 8-fold path of Buddhism. Zwa, which is a personal philosophy that's rooted in the Swahili verb, the Zulu verb Zwa, which means perception, to perceive, understanding. And then hoodoo, which is American kind of Southern spiritual practices that have Africanisms, relations to African philosophies or practices that in my family are definitely still exist. So I call on those things. Ubuntu and Ujamaa. Ubuntu, being a South African term that really is, speaking to I am because I am because we are, and because we are, the community is, therefore I am. So this community is what births the individual, and kind of the duty, the responsibility of community and all that. Ujamaa is more of, it's Swahili term, tends to, and it's dealing more with like economics and kind of socialist economics, or like kind of helping each other out in those kinds of ways. So as I think of like my theater and my practices in those terms, like how would I like to economically structure my community, my theater community, as well as the larger communities that we're in. Circularity is a big one. We can see examples of this in time, the concept of time being circular in Bantu Congo cosmology. The ring shout, which, in like South Carolina and other places in the South that African Americans engaged in. Capoeira, African Brazilian martial art that has the hoda, where you stand in a circle and clap and sing and all that as we, and everything like that, Cherokee dance, etc. You see a picture from a show that I directed, Don Terrell Who Gets to See, where I use that. Functionality, so things must be functional, they must have a purpose and be applicable. Independence and self-sufficiency. My mother raised me very independent, and a lot of influences in DC are all about, there are a lot of influences that spoke to being independent, like DC punk band Fugazi. They had their own independent label. They promoted themselves, promoted other artists, and got the word out on their own and did that kind of thing. Abstraction and the figurative, sustainability, harmony with nature, resource efficiency, junkyard theater, which is similar to a poor theater, using little resources. Vodun aesthetics from Benin, Togo region, and all of these areas, the idea of process being part of thing, and things are continually evolving. There is no unfinished work. Unpredictability, potentiality, open-endedness. And then my practices, ritual, some of the things I do, I have devotional offerings sometimes through song and dance, etc. I do shout outs, roll calls, the speaking of names often in my shows. Martial arts, I incorporate martial art training into my theater training as I train actors and work with my ensembles as a director. Mask work is something that I'm particularly fascinated in now, that I want to dig more into and really kind of master in making them, as well as learning more about them in various cultures. You see an Afipo Nigerian mask from the Afipo Masquerade, and a Cherokee Booger mask. Signifying, parody, pastiche. This was talked a lot about. Henry Louis Gates in his book, The Signifying Monkey, talks a lot about this as a key aspect of African American tradition, literary tradition, but also I think performative tradition as well. And here, this is a piece that I staged on the basketball court, where these two actors are two Black males in the same position as the Pietà, with the mother and Jesus. But I've taken that and kind of, used that and put it in a different context with different bodies. Music, of course, music, call and response, rhythms, drums, all of the various instruments that I African-American instruments and African instruments that I use. In this production of The Escape, I used the banjo and the djembe, which I thought were a fascinating combination of American and African, but also the banjo being, having its roots in Africa. Language, very important to me as well, being able to speak my own language, and there's academic language I can use, but also, to be able to just speak in my vernacular is, I think, actually is a very important statement for me, and also learning African languages. And then proverbs are very important to me. So I have a couple proverbs here from Swahili. So chaye kweli huirudia, so he who basically cast away truth always comes back to it, or the truth always comes back to hit them in the face. Ali hupatikana kwa ghali, which is basically greatness comes with a price. Abwagaye zani hubwagwa kwake, if whoever lays down destruction basically what goes around comes around. Kuanza and Dio Kutenda, which is basically to start is to actually do. And then this is from a play, Elimu yako, sio yako peke yako, ni kwa faida ya watu wote. And that means your education is not yours only, it's for the benefit of everybody. So yeah, those are things I love and I live by. And then finally, a few upcoming projects and things that I'm working on now for your interests. I'm planning on staging a huge epic production of Sunjata, an epic of Old Mali. I want to adapt that for the stage, but it's going to be, I imagine, like hundreds of dancers and singers, and it's going to be a huge spectacle. And then The Mask of Blackness by Ben Jonson, writing in the Jacobean era. This is, it's in like, basically it's a European English masque that was performed, but I want to signify on this and stage it, but change it up a little bit, the ending. It's a fascinating story. And then I'm also planning to, and I'm in the process of translating a collection of Swahili drama, and with some critical essays on that as well. So that's a lot. I hope y'all, not exhausted. It was a whirlwind, but that's all I got. So I appreciate you all for listening to me, and glad to introduce myself, and my thoughts a little bit. So take it away, Neil.
Thank you so much, Mark, for providing us with that inspiring insight into your personal background, but also the amazing array of influences that inform your work. I particularly look forward to learning more about your vision for staging of this massive staging of this Sunjata epic. I really hope that comes to fruition, and I'd like to learn more about it at some point. We have some time now for questions, answers, question, comment, discussions. Again, a couple ways you can ask in the Q&A. You can raise your hand, and I will unmute you. And I see the first hand up here is Jacqueline Mugwe, and so Jackie, I will unmute you, and you should be able to speak now.
Hi, Mark.
Hey,
I have to ask some questions. So I have two brief questions. So first of all, thank you. Really, really fascinating. The first question I had was if you're in the future planning to write some sort of oral history of your journey to being a NeoGriot. And then second, let's talk about religion. You mentioned Alan Locke. And I know him through my work on Baha'i. And so, as you know, and whenever there's a biography written about him, they don't mention his Baha'i background. And so Baha'is, of course, have written lots of works about this and how this actually influenced his vision of theater and drama. So I'm just really curious to know, like in your own journey, does the Baha'i faith come up or other faiths come up? That was it. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So yeah, definitely. I mean, I would love to kind of write a memoir / treatise. There's one of my influences artistically is a Polish, famous Polish director of the 20th century, Tadeusz Kantor. And I was introduced to him in grad school. A teacher thought that I should read him, that I would get something out of. And he wrote this. There's a collection he basically wrote a lot of small, very poetic treatises on theater and his work all throughout his career, and there's a whole collection of them. And I love the form of that. I love like how they do have they do have his artistic ideas, but they also talk about his process, and all of that is kind of in this work. And I would love to write something like that and include sort of my journey towards being a NeoGriot. I think I have a little ways for that, though. I definitely want to experience, get a little more experience and use also my work that I'm doing here at UW and working with the students and all that as part of, that research for that. As far as Baha'i faith, what's fascinating is that the Baha'i faith, I have friends who are of the Baha'i faith. I didn't actually know much about Alan Locke's connection with that faith. But I also passed by a Baha'i center that's down the road from me here in Madison that I was that's coming in my life a lot. So it's definitely something I want to look more into.
Yeah, there's a whole library about him. The Baha'is hold him up as their best prominent example of this great Baha'i person. And there's several books on how being Baha'i informed his vision of drama and theater. I will email it to you.
Please, thank you. That's amazing. Thank you for that.
I see Vincent Ogoti has his hand up, and then I also see after Vincent, we have a question in the chat from Aruna. But first, Vincent.
Great. So thank you for the opportunity. Hi, Mark. I listened to your presentation and I love it. You know, I work in theater and I think you're doing great work. So I mean, as a graduate student, I'm fascinated by many things you mentioned. With, I would love to collaborate on that part on translating Swahili drama. So I come from Kenya and I do work on in Swahili too. And number two, I love this idea that you have principles that inform your work. And I was wondering, how did you develop these principles? Is it, something you deliberately, or it has been evolving over life? I'd love to hear more about that. And finally, now, given that your theater combines these principles that you've developed and, professional work, so how can we read this theater? Is it, do we need new tools to read it? Is true African-American theater? Or do you think like the existing tools can still do when we're reading it or analyzing it? So thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for these questions. I would love to to collaborate and on the translation of Swahili drama. That would be amazing. So like in reflecting on my life, I've been privileged to have lived a lot in my time on this earth and have done a lot of things. My mother, from a very young age, had me interested. She's very fascinated with the world and cultures and so from a young age, I was reading National Geographic all the time and other books, art books and traveling and the places that we can go. And so I had a lot of different inspirations and different knowledges that I was pulling from throughout my life. And it wasn't until I got older where I kind of had this realization, this kind of change that happened to me around 2012. Where I really started to dig into all those things and synthesize them all and see how all of those things that I had lived could be useful to me in my work. And I didn't realize how much knowledge I was sitting on top of that could influence, something that was unique to me and a new practice. So yeah, that's how I came with the principles. I just study, I'm interested in everything. I'm interested in so many different things. And I think so many things are and can be relevant to my work and applied in so many different ways. So that's kind of where those things come from. I do think that, in creating this new theater, that is very much funneled through my experience, there are definitely some types of work that I have to do. Part of the project is definitely educating. I don't necessarily want to use that word necessarily, but educating the audience on how to receive the work that I'm doing, how to see it. Just like postmodern abstract work, abstract art or abstract, postmodern theater and things like that. A lot of audiences aren't used to seeing those things. They're used to typical drama and plays and kind of conventional theater. So it's very shocking to a lot of people to see those kinds of works that are leaving those traditions or going off and exploring new ways of constructing the world and everything through art. And so that also, just as those require, educating an audience to receive those and understand what's being done, what's being played with, and how things are being organized. The same thing in my theater, I think, is definitely necessary, and that's something I hope to lay out in my work with community, in my work with actors, in my work with, in my writings and all that. So yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat from Aruna, which I'll read, and then afterwards I see we have a hand from Dwayne Holland. But first, Aruna's question, I'll just read it quickly. He thanks you for the presentation, Mark. And then the question is, do you think African American genealogy, the Ancestry projects, and oral narratives play complementary or opposing roles in enhancing our knowledge of African American history or culture?
Good question. For me personally, I think it's only enhanced. It's only been an enhancement. Like I said, before, I grew up with just my mother in DC. The rest of my family was in Roanoke and far away from me. And I didn't get a lot of information about my past, my ancestry at all. My mother didn't talk a lot about it, and other family members never talked a lot about it. And I think I grew up not being super invested in this country in that way. It didn't feel like my country. I didn't feel like I there was part of me that had really strong roots here. And so, it wasn't until I started learning, like getting these stories, like actual stories in my hand when I got that book, The Hairstons, to read actual stories and then to be able to trace my way back through this country, through the bloodlines, like America lives, the story of America lives in my body, it's in my blood. It's like, a teacher of mine, a voice teacher actually, always used to say, like, our biology is our biography, right? We can read our histories in our actual bodies and how we carry ourselves and the tensions we hold and all that, but also in our blood and in everything. So yeah, it wasn't until I was able to do that I felt connected to this country, and I felt a connection to America and the entire American story. And it took acceptance of all of those things. It took acceptance to learn, to learn the traumas and see the splits on the trees of where trauma could have happened, and to be able to accept my Swiss and my Scottish and my English, as well as my African, as part of me, is what makes me African American. Like, all of those things are what make me African American, and it's a reconciling all those things that I think was important for me, and I think is important, could be important for all of us to do by doing that work.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Dwayne Holland. You should be able to speak now.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hello there.
Mark, I just wanted to say congratulations on this platform.
Thank you.
It is a complete space of nourishment and confirmation and affirmation. To be in this space with you, and to meet you a year ago, actually a year and a half ago, and the world changing, and seeing you doing this work in that African-American artistry is naturally interdisciplinary and healing in a space of cultural diplomacy. And I just wanted to just say thank you for this. I look forward to working with you and forging this way, as you are the tip of the spear. So much love to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. It's been way too long, and I can't wait to reconnect, and very much look forward to working with you and sharing, breaking some bread and all that as well. So.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably have time for one more question or comment if there's one out there. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone, so I'll just take this opportunity also to thank you, Mark, so much for this presentation. And I think I speak for everyone in saying that we really look forward to seeing what's coming next from you, and to collaborating with you to bring some of those projects to fruition. So thank you very much.
Asanteni, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate you giving me this time. So see you soon.